F124 has been out for a little while, reviews are quite literally mixed on Steam, and as an average it's had the worst initial reception of any F1 game since F1 2015. EA and Codemasters recently released the version 1.3 update which made a number of changes, most notably to the car handling. And it's worth saying how incredibly divisive the handling was, as a lot of people liked it and thought it was a big improvement. Of course, loads of people thought the opposite, and I understand both perspectives, as I'll get into. The patch also fixes some of the game's issues, but not all of them, and it's worth noting what the game was like when it was released. And this video is about more than just the handling though, since player numbers on Steam have trended downwards in the EA era. Of course, with the caveat in F124's case that we're pre-Christmas, which should give it a bit of a bump. And across all platforms, F123's initial sales were down almost 47% compared to F122. So there's a lot to go over. The physics model was just the latest point of contention. It's not much of a surprise that many of the big content creators and esports players were against the changes made, since what EA and Codemasters did, intentionally or not, is make the cars easier to drive. And that's a bit of a simplification. I mean, unnatural was the go-to word to describe the handling from a lot of the big names in the community. Certainly driving in the wet was unnatural. It was more like playing a rally game, since you're just constantly counter-steering yet never in any real danger of losing control completely. The problem there being that what is a balanced AI level in the dry suddenly becomes far too easy in the wet, due to the amount of grip. Hence how I took pole by nearly a second over Verstappen in my Williams driver career. But I say the handling is divisive since it's gone down well with a decent chunk of the community, and if you're a more casual player / play with a pad rather than a wheel, I get why. It's much easier to get up to speed with than some earlier games, particularly F122, but even F1 2021 was arguably a bit too knife-edge for a game that was leaning heavily on its story mode, a game mode aimed at more casual or newer players to the F1 games, and which offers no practice before dumping you in the middle of a race. If you look back at the older Codemasters F1 games, I would say they were predominantly single-player, mainly career mode focused racing games for people who are already big F1 fans. I'm not sure that's the case though in the EA era, and there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but the games now just feel more confused, and like they're trying to appeal to everyone but instead attracting no one. Because you could argue that they're trying to appeal to more casual gamers or newcomers to the racing game genre, or Formula 1 as a sport, or maybe both. For that audience, I get why you would put so much effort into a story mode, one that the developers have openly said takes inspiration from Drive to Survive, and why classic content would be seen as far less essential to include, and why you would make the handling so much easier to get to grips with, particularly on a pad. Never mind all the various assists and settings that have been added in recent games to give an extra helping hand to those who need it. The most in-your-face example being the ability to turn off collisions in an offline race. I also sort of get why you would include supercars in F1 22 and 23 if you're going for a more casual crowd. But you're fighting a losing battle when compared to something like Gran Turismo 7, incidentally another game that's got a confused identity, as GT7 deals with road cars better in every single way and actually let you race them against each other, and has an Alpine A110. So you can actually have representation from all the current F1 manufacturers, and I know it isn't a supercar, but if supercars were added to the F1 games for the sake of cross-promotion so F1 manufacturers can promote their road cars, and I fail to see any other reason why you would go out of your way to include them, then why were Alpine left out? And along a similar line, I'm not sure who's buying the F1 games so they can decorate their apartment and unlock new furnishings, although that's not on F1 24 either. The new clothing options are still there, and the only crowd that would even have a remote chance of appealing to is the more casual one. I'm not a marketing expert, but surely it would make more sense for EA and Codemasters, as well as the brands that they're cross-promoting, if they were integrated into My Team Career. I'm thinking as selectable sponsors, and that's not a mad idea. Codemasters have done exactly that in their older games, and even had livery options based entirely around real-life companies. Surely that would be better marketing for, say, Puma. And it would make My Team Career slightly more authentic. Makes more sense than buying Virtual Beats headphones, but that's a totally separate point, as of course that's meant to tie into a part of the F1 games no one asked for. To be fair though, let's forget about the previous EA F1 games and just focus on F1 24, because Arguably, that game is focused more on the career mode audience. I've done about a season and a half of Driver Career and, well, it's good and bad, and I'd sum it up by saying good ideas, reasonable execution, but probably hurt by releasing this game earlier in the year than usual. I'll go over it more so in my all 10 seasons of Driver Career Mode video later in the year, but we're talking everything from the game being unable to do basic maths, to top teams offering contracts far too easily and quickly, to the car upgrade balancing in terms of how quickly you can upgrade your own team and that undermining the point of moving teams, the recognition system and the fact it ties into potentially, long term at least, crucial secret car upgrades, actively discourages moving teams. And finally, how the secret meetings seem to be pointless as I decline further talks with Aston Martin in the third meeting, yet they still offer me a seat at the end of the year anyway. Never mind the ones that aren't career mode specific but are single player issues you're most likely to encounter during a career mode playthrough. Everything from needing to run slicks in a wet qualifying session to the unbreakable DRS trains, to the fact that cars don't repair wing damage, and in fact I'm not sure if they ever voluntarily retire at all. I've done more than one career mode race, but the fact I encountered all of those in the same one speaks volumes. Never mind the previously mentioned issue of the AI being much easier to beat in the wet than they are in the dry. I'll give Codemasters some credit since the R&D scenarios are, at the very least, a nice idea. The balancing out the field scenario in particular I'm looking forward to trying out later in the career. The overall presentation of Driver Career is really nice and it's clear a lot of thought went into the game mode this year. Glitches and questionable design has just slightly spoiled it. Also, almost all of these changes, even the simple ones like the driver grid reveal and even the in-game email summarizing driver changes, aren't in the My Team Career mode. But if you're going for an audience made up of those who are big F1 fans, then why wait 4 years to make a major change to the core game mode and in the meantime only focus on a story mode, and I've talked about my thoughts on that in a separate video, and F1 World, which is far too easy and disconnected from real life F1 to be of any real interest to big fans of the sport. And if F1 World is meant for newcomers, then why laden the system with parts and multiple currencies that are used for different types of resources, and then there's the ability to upgrade existing parts and dismantle parts, and then there's contracts of different perks to give to personnel and sponsors. Am I the only one who thinks people could be overwhelmed and put off by the complexity? And obviously they're not aiming at the hardcore, and since such a tiny percentage of total game sales are on PC, which is where most of the big content creators and esports players reside, I can see the business case for doing so. But that's a crowd you don't want to upset given the reach they have, and bearing in mind the developers have to consider that their games are used for F1 esports or F1 sim racing, whatever it's called nowadays. One of, if not the largest racing esports competition on the planet, and with a huge prize pool on the line. Whether it be by choice or contractual obligation, EA and Codemasters have to deal with that. And circling back to the handling model, Formula 1 cars are 1000 horsepower, rear-wheel drive, aerodynamic downforce dependent cars. I've never, not even when I was a young kid, seen the F1 games as being the most approachable in the racing game genre. Past a certain point, making the F1 games at their core easy just ends up misrepresenting the very sport it's based on. I look back at F1 2019 and 2020 as the high points of the series. Big steps forward over the earlier games in that generation, especially in terms of career mode. Had classic cars in F1 2019's case dating all the way back to the 70s. Had shortened circuits, which was some nice variety, and they were just playgrounds for fun, especially with classic cars. And racing them, not only was it some much appreciated variety, but it was just epic, due to the different characteristics each of the cars had, and it was a brilliant what-if fantasy for an F1 fan. Plus it still had the championships mode, which never got even close to living up to its potential, but it had the right idea. And it's worth pointing out that F1 2019 and 2020 still wouldn't have been released by now in their respective years, and EA trying to release the F1 games earlier in the year is a good thing, but when you look at F1 24 and the amount of glitches it had on release, you've got to question whether or not that's the right approach. But crucially, those were F1 games which felt like they were made by F1 fans for F1 fans and were approachable without being patronising, and managed to strike a balance with the car handling which meant the majority of the player base liked it. I think F1 24 is slightly better than F1 23, but that's not a particularly high bar to clear. Same can be said for F1 23 relative to 22, but overall opinion and interest has gone down in that time, and I get why, because the improvements are marginal, and I don't know who would look at the recent titles and say, this is exactly what I want the F1 games to be. It's almost like when Codemasters' Dirt series went from the acclaimed Dirt Rally to Dirt 4. I don't know what Dirt 4 was trying to be. It's almost like it tried to strike a middle ground of all the previous Dirt games. But long and short of it, it had a confused identity, and it's like it didn't know who its target audience was. And I think that's the mistake that's been made with the F1 games in the EA era.